What's the mechanism whereby we get elevated A1C, and what's the mechanism whereby an elevated A1C leads to health problems? Let's take a closer look. How hemoglobin A1C becomes elevated. Over the past 60 years, something has happened to explain the tenfold increase in diabetes risk in the US. That thing is mostly consumption of refined grains and added sugar. When we have refined grains, now refined grains are grains that have the bran and the germ removed. They're just the starch. When we eat them, they already start to become sugar on our tongue. There's an enzyme called salivary amylase that converts starches into sugar on our tongue. That's why we can have such a strong attraction to bread and pastas. They actually start to raise our blood sugar in our mouths. So refined grains are grains without the bran and the germ. They rapidly convert to blood sugar all at once, and that causes a spike in blood sugar. The other component that raises blood sugar in the foods we eat is added sugar. High fructose corn syrup, for example, which was introduced in the early 1970s, is a very cheap, palatable added sugar that increased the amount of sugar in the American diet exponentially over the past 60 years. But it doesn't have to be high fructose corn syrup. It can be agave nectar. The point is that it's an added sugar to the foods we eat, and grains that are devoid of their fiber, which slow digestion and increase the rapidity of blood sugar spikes in our bloodstream. But that's not all. So it's not only the quality of the food that's deteriorated that has caused elevated blood sugars, it's also excess calorie intake. I can show you what I mean by excess calorie intake on this graph. The average American in 1960 was consuming 2,880 calories per day. That has increased to over 3,600 calories, almost a 25% increase rate of calorie consumption. What consumption of refined grains and added sugar plus excess calorie intake leads to is obesity and insulin resistance. We can understand obesity in one sense by just the sheer excess calories we're consuming in the American diet. Insulin resistance is a little more complicated, and it's well illustrated on this graph. When we have foods that are low in fiber and have added sugar, in other words, refined grains and foods with added sugar, we raise the blood sugar in our bloodstream. What that does is it causes our pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's released when our blood sugar is high, and it tells our muscle cells and the rest of our body to take in that sugar from the bloodstream and use it as fuel. Only problem is that if we keep eating foods that raise our blood sugar, our insulin remains persistently elevated. The receptors for insulin start to become resistant. They need more and more insulin to respond to the signal to take in blood cells. One aspect of what happens is that our pancreas starts to fatigue, is not able to keep up with the constant demand for insulin. Another thing that happens is because our cells are not able to take up the glucose in our bloodstream because of the insulin resistance, the receptors not responding to insulin, we feel hungry. So our cells are not getting the fuel they need, and they send hunger signals to our brain, which means we eat more, and which means we go back into this cycle of eating more refined grains and foods with added sugar, which never actually translate into fuel for ourselves, which causes us to be more hungry. The other aspect of this is when we develop obesity from excess calorie intake, our fat cells independently contribute to insulin resistance. They can send signals to make other cells less responsive to insulin. So we have here an explanation of how the quality of the food we eat, specifically food that is high in refined grains, low in fiber, and contains added sugar, as well as an excess caloric intake, both result in persistently high blood sugars and persistently high hemoglobin A1c. To compound things, chronic stress and a sedentary lifestyle also contribute. What chronic stress does, and I'm not just talking about stress that people have with work, I'm talking about anxiety, which you can learn more about in the anxiety recommendation health score. I'm also talking about sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation is a stress on the body. And when we are sleep deprived, our bodies think there's an emergency. Obviously, if he's staying up this late, there must be something wrong. There must be a lion to be ready for. So we are evolutionarily designed to sense emergency if we're up at night. And that causes cortisol, a stress hormone, to be released. And cortisol causes our blood sugar level to rise. So this contributes to the persistent high blood sugars. And this contributes to the persistent high blood sugars. A sedentary lifestyle also contributes to elevated blood sugars. We have an enzyme called glucose transporter, or GLUT. This is found on fat and muscle cells. What it is responsible for doing is taking up blood sugar from the circulation. If we are sedentary, meaning if we're not engaging in the recommended amount of aerobic exercise, in strength training, if we're exceeding 8 hours of total sitting time per day, if we're often sitting for longer than 30 minutes at a time without taking a 1-minute standing break, our GLUT transporter becomes less active, meaning our peripheral cells, our tissues, do not take up blood sugar as they might otherwise if we were physically active. So we can see here this multifactorial process whereby hemoglobin A1c becomes elevated. From foods that raise blood sugar to excess calorie intake leading to fat, which causes insulin resistance, chronic stress, including anxiety, depression, sleep deprivation, and a sedentary lifestyle.